Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to my talk. This is You Could Have Invented Susceptibilities. My name is Andy Gordon. Louder? Okay. My name is Andy Gordon. I am a research scientist at Timaeus. The genesis of this talk is that the work that I do, that you will be seeing if you hang out for another half hour in George's talk, involves susceptibilities a lot. And I frequently find myself explaining them to people who have far-ranging backgrounds, from like friends from grad school to my parents. And I want to give a presentation that is as minimally mathematical as possible to try and focus on the main ideas and hide some of the thornier details. If you want to hear a really rigorous talk about the definition of susceptibilities, I encourage you to come to Dan's talk at 10 a.m. this morning. But what we're going to be doing here is presenting a story, highlighting the details, because having the right story when doing research matters a lot. You're interpreting something that you don't understand, and I think that I can convey this to a broader audience than currently knows about it. Oh, one sec. Okay. What are susceptibilities? So here's the story that you would have heard this morning. You've killed it. Susceptibilities are a measure how a small perturbation in data induces a first-order change in the loss landscape. They're given by this formula, which we will return to and try and explain some parts of. And the motivation comes from statistical mechanics. Why don't I need to be? The clicker just died. Oh, is it better now? Oh, we're great. Sweet. So I want to answer that question again and try and present a different motivation and moral that tracks closely with how I use these things in my research, but is, I think, a little underemphasized by the previous one. So I think of this as a weights-based analog to ablations. It's motivated, this is the you could have invented susceptibilities part, by like common things that are wrong with ablations and hard to fix. And we're not going to have intuition from physics or higher math. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on that. I think anyone could tell you I really like high math intuitions for things. But in the interest of getting this as far as possible, we're going to just try and bushwhack our way towards the definition. Susceptibilities are like ablations. I think the easiest way to see this is that they have a similar functional type. For both of these things, you've got a model, you've got a piece of the model, and you've got some task that you want to know about. The input is those three things, and the output is a number. And the meaning of this number is, how important is this piece of the model to doing this task? And even further, why I started making this talk, both of these techniques go about this in the same way. You damage the piece of the model that you care about, and then you see how does that change performance on the task. So there's a long history of like doing this in science, and I think this goes back to like neuroscience, and the picture we've got up here is Phineas Gage, who in 1848 had a railroad spike shot through his skull, taken out a big chunk of his frontal lobe, and lived for 12 more years, but everyone claims was a very different person in terms of personality. And I think neuroscientists would like it if they could be shooting railroad spikes through brains and like seeing what happened when you broke something. But we can do that. And that's what ablations are, and that's what I think susceptibilities are as well. So get your railroad spikes. Here's a story of an ablation in sort of the most basic ablation experiment I can design. And we're going to try and understand this, look at some issues with it, and see why that leads to susceptibilities. I've got my model, my two components, we'll call them A and B, and task T, and I want to know which component is more important to performance on the task. Ideally, I can say something like, I damaged A, and performance did so-and-so, and I damaged B, and performance did so-and-so, so B is more important. And for ablations, by damage, we mean do a forward run of the model, look at activations within or produced from A, within or produced from B, modify them in some way, and then see how that tracks. And then I want to have a note that I'll return to later that you need some sort of normalization. Like you should have a baseline of like, I damaged A and task T got worse, but if you damage A and the entire model gets worse, then maybe this isn't about T. So you need to have some comparison to like overall how much damage did I do. A really important thing about ablations is that if you're going to run the sort of experiment that I just listed, you need to have really strong belief that whatever you did to A is comparable to whatever you did to B. And this, when you're modifying activations, I think is actually really hard. So this is hard because like you can change it, and you change it by like taking numbers and turning into some other numbers. But if you're not careful, one change applied in two different places has really different effects. So for two heads, maybe the activations in head 1, if they were on the real line, look something like some normal distribution spiked at 2, and the activations in head 2 are a fatter normal distribution spiked at 0. If you zero ablate, meaning you take the activations and send them to 0, you've violated a little bit the integrity of your experiment, right? Because you really mangled head 1 and you didn't do that much to head 2. If you mean ablate, it's the same issue because the variance here is different from the variance there. So there are some ways to get around this, but a lot of ways for doing ablations have this sort of issue where you don't know what this distribution is and you want to modify it, but if there's two unknown distributions, how do you know you're making the same change in both places? Another issue with ablations is what I'm calling sequentiality. Ablations are generated in sequence. And so, right, you do a forward pass of the model. This makes things hard because some activations depend on previous ones, right? Like a lot of ablation techniques would be a really bad idea to do if you cared about the activations of like the embedding matrix. If you zero ablate the activations of the embedding matrix, like you've ganked your whole model. You're not going to get good results. You're not going to be able to have a good experiment. If you wanted to compare how important is the embeddings to something else, ablations would not really be a good tool to do this. My solution is that instead of changing activations, you change the weights. So some notes on what that looks like. Our model is a vector W star in a weight space W, which is the big real vector space of like all the possible values, all the possible weights in the model could take. Points near W star, which I'm going to call perturbations, are models that are similar to the original. So instead of taking activations and changing them, we should try and find other sets of weights that are similar to our original one. You can vary a component, like because the weight space has an entry for each individual weight. If I cared about varying just a single attention head, that corresponds to a subspace in W, which means I'm only perturbing in certain directions and I'm keeping others fixed. Right? So we can do the same sort of things. This is hopefully a pretty obvious picture. I want to point out immediately that we don't have these sort of sequentiality problems, right? I can change, I can tweak the weights on the embedding matrix, and separately I can tweak the weights on a certain attention head, and those two tweaks are largely independent of each other, right? Like I can do one, I can do the other, I can do both. Tweaking the embedding matrix isn't going to ruin the rest of the model. I know there are some methods of ablation that also get around this. I would add as a note the problems I said, like comparison and sequentiality. If you think you know a method of ablation that really gets around both of those, I would be interested, because I was thinking about it when making this talk. And I tried to like make a two-pronged attack that I thought was undodgeable. So hopefully you're convinced that we can try and move around weight space. Here's a really simple example that motivates, I think, sort of the core idea underlying a lot of Timaeus research. I've got a two-parameter model, W1 and W2. Here's some things about it. The original model is 0.21, and loss is very sensitive when I change W1 and not so sensitive when I change W2. If we were sampling things that were near this model, but like wanted to be slightly different, what would make for good sampling? I think it's something like this picture here, where you can see like 2,1. We want to be near 2,1. We can vary in W2, and we can vary in W1 But by the looks of this heat map, we vary less in W1 than we would in W2, right? So we want to stay close to W star. And as I just said, we want to have small variation in one direction and larger variation in another. So then if we talk about damaging W1, we select something from this distribution, just restricted to lie along here, and we're not making a big change to W1. If we talk about damaging W2, we select something from this distribution, going along this vertical line, and we're making a larger change. And I think if we do something like this, we have more confidence that the changes we make are comparable, because there's this basic underlying, like W1 was more sensitive, so we made a smaller change. To achieve what we want, at Timaeus we use the localized Gibbs posterior, which is a probability distribution on the weight space that is proportional to this exponential formula. So let's unpack it a little bit. This first term, negative beta L of W, means that models that have lower loss on the overall data are more likely. The second term means that models that are closer to W star are more likely. And in combination, we get something like this, which is we want models close to W star, and we're favoring the ones that have better loss. I want to say that actually sampling from this distribution is a fairly heroic thing. We use SGLD. There's a lot of work that goes into it. I strongly recommend, if you want to know more about this, go to Rohan Hitchcock's talk. Is it Thursday, I think? Where he's going to get into the issues. And then on top of this, we've got these two numbers here, beta and gamma, and tuning these parameters, as Dan I think mentioned in his talk as well, remains hard. This is sensitive. Our sampling process is sensitive to the tuning. I don't want to elide over the fact that there's a lot of work to be done here. Okay, so now let's head back to the full model per token susceptibility formula. And we're going to unpack it and see what's actually happening. It's a covariance, and this W from beta, I'm following the notation in the paper a little bit, means we're sampling a weight from the localized Gibbs posterior around W star, whatever our original model was at. And then we're taking a covariance of two random variables, or functions of this random variable W. The first of which is the loss at W minus the loss at W star, right? So the change in loss. And the second, it's got two things in it. The little l xyw is the loss on our task, right? It's the loss from predicting token y immediately after context x. And I'm following closely to the paper and the work that I do, but there are in fact a lot of different things that you can put there. The paper goes into how you generate this term by thinking about shifts in the data distribution. If you cared about ablations, you could replace this with the loss on many different things, or really like any sort of numerical evaluator of your model. Okay, so once again, this covariance formula, we're going to rearrange a little bit. I really just used linearity in the second argument. And now we have blue term and red term. So this thing I want to claim as basically a weight space successor to ablations. What we are doing with this covariance is measuring how correlated is loss on our task with change in overall loss as we perturb the weights in our original model according to this localized Gibbs posterior that is sensitive to the different directions. This other term, this is coming from the story that I'm not telling, and that you should attend Dan's talk at 10 a.m. if you want to hear. But my justification for this is we can look at the left term and get some sort of meaning there, because the right term is not a function of our task. It's showing up here, and it's a function of whatever this W star is, but it's constant across different tasks. And in practice, when we actually use this data for many, many tasks, we end up doing some sort of normalization, and that thing falls out. So the result is that this full model per token susceptibility looks a lot like what you would do with an ablation. Damage the model, track how there's a change in loss and a change in loss on your task, and how these two things are related to each other. Of course, we want to restrict to a component of the model, right? Like my whole thing was that we care about component A versus component B. And this is where I will confess it gets a little weirder. But what we end up doing is multiplying the first term in the covariance by a Dirac delta that is supported on the component, or by which I mean the plane in weight space that corresponds to this component. What this cashes out to is that this covariance, right, is you can write it in terms of expectations of certain products of things and products of expectations. And the effect of the Dirac delta is to move those expectations to, instead of ranging over this distribution on the whole space, to range over this distribution restricted to the directions we want to move in to damage our component. I would be happy, especially I think I'll have abundant time for questions, but afterwards to talk more about this. I'm a believer that I think there's a bunch of interesting things that we could be doing here. If you come from this ablation story, like the covariance makes sense, but now I'm trying to sell you on several extra terms. And if you walk out of this talk thinking like, oh, I'm excited to do something with sampling from the localized Gibbs posterior and like trying to change my ablation experiments, but I want to do it some other way, I consider that a win for this talk, and I hope you will come talk to me about how you're doing your thing. Okay. This whole talk was about susceptibilities versus ablations. So let's see what this looks like in practice. So in the paper introducing susceptibilities, they look at how do our weight-restricted susceptibilities compare to ablation in whatever component we're handling, and find no correlation at all. Like these are several of these different plots. There seemed to be no match whatsoever. This is, I mean, depending on your belief in susceptibilities, your belief in ablations, this could be a good thing. We freed ourselves from ablations. This could be a bad thing. This is a bogus new concept, up for interpretation. However, there is some relation that we found later in some more recent research. So we were running per token susceptibilities on Pythia 70 million, and we run a lot of them. If you stick around, you'll hear George's talk about the rainbow serpent, explaining what exactly this is and how we look at it. But the point is that we noticed that the model, Pythia 70 million, was doing something interesting when it was running through a context and it came across the phrase as well. It liked to predict as, because in human language, we often say as well as, and we're less likely to say as well house. And George will explain some of the methods. We found this in the model. And furthermore, this cluster of susceptibilities, these per token susceptibilities from as well, next token as, indicated that layer 0, head 7, was an important head for this. All the other heads are vaguely positive, but this one is strongly negative. And so in this case, with a really clear signal that susceptibilities were flagging a head as important to a certain process, we tried it on ablations as well. And ablating layer 0, head 7 in Pythia 70 million really drastically changed the loss on as well as in a way that other heads didn't. So what is the full relationship? Under what circumstances would we suspect susceptibilities and ablations tell us the same thing? Open question. I'd be interested in thinking about it and figuring it out more. If this is something that you think you have some ideas on, come talk to me. Thanks for coming. Please, we've got 5 minutes left. Feel free to ask me questions. A lot of these talks, I feel like I've wanted to ask questions like, what is X for something up on the board? And then I haven't, and then the questions get really technical, and I don't want to, but I want to specifically encourage that sort of question because I'm trying to present this to as big an audience as possible. Thank you. Yeah.
What can you go into like that choice of task? What function?
So the common thing that we do is we have, instead of the loss on a certain task, is the loss on a data set that is in some ways different from the data set the model was trained on. So if the model was trained on a lot of data from like the pile, you can create some sort of new pile by upweighting some collections of it and getting a whole general data set. This is a specific example of this, where sort of the theoretical data set that we got upweights this one context token pair entirely and downweights everything else. Yeah.
So what do you in practice do this? You don't need to evaluate that on a lot of data because otherwise you are sensitive to that, like in this chunk of text there happens to be a bit more data than in this chunk of text. And you need like to evaluate so many batches that like all that works out together. You get a very representative sample of the file.
What is the thing you're worried about washing out?
So what I'm worried about is that if you draw so when you evaluate the loss, right? You evaluate the loss in some batches for the file.
Mm-hmm.
And these batches are just some subset of the file.
Mm-hmm.
And you would need a large enough subset of the file that you are representative of the file and that you don't have random fluctuations in your batches that become comparable to whichever data interpretation you're using.
Yeah, I agree with that.
How large batches do you need, or like how many batches do you need?
I am going to throw the next speaker under the bus and say George would be able to provide a much better answer to that question as he was closer to the sampling process for this than me. But, yeah. Hey, George.
Are you asking me to go to that?
No. More questions? Yeah. All right, so the sequentiality point was thrown in. No, that's fine. So the sequentiality point was thrown in because there's sort of a bunch of methods of ablation, some of which are better than others. And one of them that I wanted to address, though I guess it was sort of a subtweet, was like resampling ablation. And resampling ablation would be a poor choice for comparing the embedding matrix, the importance of that to a task with an attention head, because if you resample activations out of the embedding matrix, you've ruined the whole model. There are some methods of ablation that I think could handle this well. If you took your activations and added some random noise to them, that wouldn't suffer from sequentiality. But I think it would have the same comparison issue because we don't know how big things are and we need to adjust for that when adding the noise. I don't think resample activation has this issue of comparison because it has a nice claim at doing the same thing in two spaces, but it struggles with sequentiality. And then I wanted to say that modifying the weights first doesn't have an issue with sequentiality because I can make a small change to the embedding matrix and not have to worry about ruining the entire rest of the model. And then using the localized Gibbs posterior also doesn't suffer from this issue of comparison because that distribution is sensitive to like which things need big changes and which ones need small ones. And then the point was that among ablation methods that I'm aware of, nothing survives both tests. Yeah.
Other examples of features that you managed to pick up on can't be found using those ablation.
I'm not sure. To be honest, when we've looked at features, we haven't spent most of the time trying to see if they could be justified through ablations. And if we did, a failure there is not indicative that it can't be. So it's a good question, but I don't have a great answer. Vinayak, and maybe the last question to give George some time to set up.
So if you take the analogy with going down the frontal lobe seriously, then neither of these methods are doing that, right? Because like you're not actually removing a component of the model. So I'm not curious, just if anyone knows, is there an ablation technique where, like, if there's a component of the network that maps RTD to RTD, then you could.
Yeah, so maybe blowing out your frontal lobe is like zero ablating the output of an attention head. You've effectively removed that attention head from any contributions to the model.
Yeah, but it's not clear zero ablation.
I think probably this crowd is not too hyped on zero ablation, and I feel it's not a great method.